Moment. So if you have not participated in what we call dotmocracy to over there with the blue dots, please do so. I'm sure Ian is going to let me know when we're ready to get started. Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Evans. I am here from the architecture and planning firm of Barton Partners, and it's really great to be here in Radnor Township. So tonight we are here to talk about the Willows Mansion, and this is the first of a number of public discussions about the future uses of the Willows Mansion and its important asset to the Radnor Township community and to the region. And so I'm going to just give a quick background and then do some introductions, but I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight to join us. We're happy to have you here. The Willows, as you all know, is a really important community asset. It has a picturesque landscape. It has architectural history. It offers beautiful trails. It offers recreation. It offers a place for people to come together. And in this era where many people spend times on their computers and on their phones, and we try and bring our families together in places where we can come together, the Willows is a treasure. And we've got to figure out how we can give guidance to Radnor Township Board of Commissioners about what would the future of the Willows Mansion be, and how can we help with citizens and professionals together, working together to figure out how can the Willows Mansion be treasured, and how can we create a business plan, a operational plan that will guide future use of the mansion and future investment in the mansion. And so that's today. We also have this is a remarkable estate built in 1910 that has great heritage, great architecture, wonderful details that are to be treasured, but they need care. They need investment, they need upgrades, and so making critical decisions about what to improve, what to fix, how much money to spend on roofs, and how much money to spend on stairways, and how much money to spend on accessibility improvements are tough calls because resources are always limited. So we want to make sure that we let you know that we understand that this building and its setting are a treasure, and we need to work together to figure out how are we going to honor that treasure and how are we going to invest in it. So, to let you know how we got here, on May 10th of this year, the Radnor Township Board of Commissioners issued a request for proposals. And our firm, Barton Partners, and our colleagues from Urban Partners and from Radnor Engineering responded, and we were selected on June 12th to be the consultants to assist your township in making, sort of creating this operational and business plan for the Willows Mansion. And tonight is the first in a series of public meetings to engage, to listen, to hear from citizens, neighbors, about what are ways that the mansion could best be used. So the focus of tonight's meeting is really on the future use of the Willows Mansion. So I'm going to introduce our team, and I'm going to ask my colleague Steve Gabriel from Radnor to come up and introduce himself. And so our firm here, Barton Partners, we are planners and architects. We are a 60-person planning and architecture firm based in Norristown, and so we do planning processes like these where we have to help communities figure out tough issues and figure out what are the right ways to move forward. And so we do the planning, but we also do the architecture. And in the back is my colleague, Bill Warwick, a principal of architecture at our firm. And so he and I are going to be working in tag team in both the planning side as well as the architecture side of making sure that we come up with some good alternatives. I'm going to let Steve Gabriel introduce himself and his firm. Steve.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, Ritu is part of the Barton team on this project and really glad to be a part of it. It's always fun to work with the residents in the community, and so we're really looking forward to this. I'll be working with Mark on the public input process that's part of this project. And then also, because we're an engineering and environmental science and planning firm, we're going to provide a little bit of, I think, input and information related to this overall site and start talking about perhaps some needs and issues related to access to the mansion, parking, the driveway, things like that to be in terms of making that mansion usable and comfortably usable for everyone who might have an interest in that. So we're looking forward to the project again and glad to be here. Great. Thanks, Mark.
And Steve and I are going to work collaboratively to make sure that we hear a lot of ideas from you, because this is going to be an interactive evening. So far, we have, as folks entered the room, we have two boards where we have been asking everyone to do what we call dotmocracy. Grab a blue dot and put it on one of two topics. We've asked people to answer the question, how many times have you been to the Willows Mansion? 5, 10, 20, more, whatever. And what kinds of uses have you enjoyed and your family enjoyed at the mansion, so that we can get a bit of a snapshot? Because part of the purpose of this meeting is to make sure that we start, because we have not been a part of this process until just recently, but we want to get a clear snapshot of what's happening now, how have people been enjoying the mansion up until now, so that as we look to the future, we can be guided by what worked in the past. So in a few, after a little later, we will come back and report to everyone what we've learned so far about how frequently people have been visiting the mansion and what kinds of uses have been used in recent years. The one other group that I forgot to mention here who will be joining us, not at this meeting, but a number of the upcoming meetings, is a group called Barton Partners, and they are community and economic development consultants. They have done no less than about 30 of these types of economic studies for historic resources and cultural resources like the Willows Mansion to come up with the financial underpinnings of what would work looking to the future. Because this isn't just about great ideas about use, it's about marrying together ideas of how the mansion can be used with economic strategies that make sense for the township. And so Jim Hartling and his colleague Chris Lankanaugh will both be involved in helping to bring this together as a operational and business plan. So they'll be doing research into other similar facilities in the area and what kind of costs it takes to operate those facilities. They'll be doing research into what is the revenue that can be expected if someone were to, rent a space like this for a day or 3 hours, and they'll be looking at the financial models to make sure that this makes sense as we move forward. So that is their role. Project schedule. We want to make sure that we let you know why we're here tonight, which is mainly to talk about uses, and I'm going to talk in a few minutes about sort of the guiding principles that we're starting with as we get started in this process. We will, in the next week or so, be having a meeting with Township staff to make sure that we hear the wisdom of what the Radnor Township staff has, because the operation of this facility over the last decades, we want to make sure we learn from what has been working in the past. And then we will end this sort of discovery and listening phase with a series of a memo outlining a range of potential uses as we look to the future. The next step, which comes just next week, is that we're going to report back to the Board of Commissioners at the July 17th Commissioners meeting, and we're going to share What we've learned from this meeting, we're going to share and sort of tabulate all the information and make sure that we report back. And so that we will be focusing on programming and sort of operational ideas for the mansion. The next meeting will be, we will attend the Board of Commissioners meeting on August 14th, and we will be looking at a draft business plan. We will be looking at programming and facility needs, some conceptual plans for how the first floor might lay out or whatever recommendations, look at operational costs, capital costs, projected revenues, and how might decisions be made about which uses are allowed as we move forward. And we'll certainly, our job is not to make a final recommendation. Our job is to present alternatives. We're there to provide information so that your commissioners can make an informed decision and give us guidance as to where they would like us to go, which alternatives are worth looking at as we move forward. And then the final step is September 11th at the Board of Commissioner meetings. We will come back and we will present the final alternatives to be considered for this Willows Mansion business plan. So that's where we're heading. And then I'm going to let you know the 10 principles that we began this process with. And some of them are clearly going to be the tough issues, because this process has been going on for a while, and we're hoping that we have listened to what's been going on in recent months and years. And so the first principle that we've heard is important is public use, because this is a publicly owned park, and that this should be used for public uses, and there's a deed that says that it should be used for public uses. And so that is the first place that we're starting from. Second is, we shouldn't just think of the mansion in a vacuum. This is a part of a larger public park that has many different uses, recreational events. We've got the Skunk Hollow and the community gardens and a lot of different things. So we want to make sure that this is considered in the larger context. There's a lot of studies that have been done over the years, financial studies, code studies. We're going to make sure that we build upon all that good work. So that's what we will be doing. Economic sustainability. The business plan should demonstrate that there's adequate revenue to cover the operating costs. Buildings take money to heat and have electricity and water, and so we're going to make sure that we present an economic model to say, how will the revenue work, how will the operating costs be paid for, and there's a lot of information that we'll be gathering to make that happen. Because of so many of the studies that we've seen in recent year or so, we learned that the costs of renovating the second floor and the third floor may be cost prohibitive. And so part of the direction that we heard from early conversations is that the first floor of the mansion is the most public. It's the one that, if you've been there, you've probably been on the first floor. I would be curious to hear how many folks have been to inside the mansion who are here. Okay, good. Well, I think we've got 100%. How many have been to the second floor? I would say 2/3. How many have been to the third floor? I see maybe 1/3. So I think we need to look, as we look to the future, to figure out, is the cost benefit of putting an additional stair to get to the second floor that might, serve code and egress purposes, is that a wise investment? We don't know the answer to that right now, but it's worth considering. And so focusing on that first floor is a good, is where we've begun this process. Another key element is right-sized events. And as you'll see in a minute, right now this focuses on the idea that there should be a wide range of events at the mansion, and that they may typically involve 25 to 150 people. And that number is really based not on anyone sort of picking a number out of a hat. it is guided by history as to what, and you'll see in a minute that there's some history over the last 15 years or so that sort of reaffirms that that range of uses is consistent with what has been used in recent years. The next one is the view. Celebrate the views. That they are majestic, they are powerful, and we want to make sure that however the mansion is used in the future, that we're building upon those good views. Engage the community, which is what we're doing right now as the next principle. And then site connectivity. Tie together the site. You know, in case you forget, the parking lot doesn't have this wonderful sidewalk with beautiful trails to get it. It has a driveway. And so suddenly if you're walking up that trail with your aging mother or aging father or whatever, and you're trying to make sure they get there safely, we need to make sure that the sidewalks connect together and that the walkways connect together in reasonable ways. And then the final thing is to be reminded, this is a township-wide destination. The Radnor Township taxpayers have purchased this land, have maintained it, and we need to make sure it remains viable as a township-wide destination. Here is a map focusing on the Willows location. It highlights the cottage, the creek, the pond, the parking lot, but the reminder here, the picnic area, the Skunk Hollow Community Farm. The focus of this study is on the mansion. I think we understand that in future phases, many folks will want to focus on what is the future of the cottage. It's an important resource. It needs maintenance. It needs care. It needs love. But we need to start with the gem, and the mansion is where we're starting. Here's a little bit of background that we learned from an August 8th, 2012 report. And this report, called the Willows Property Report, was prepared by Radnor Township, and it highlighted the frequency of use between 1998 and 2011. And so that report, which is on the Township website, identified that there were maybe at peak, a couple years had about 160 events in the mansion, and one of the lowest years maybe there were 125 uses of the mansion in a year, and the average is about 140 uses in one of those years. And so that's an important baseline of how it has been used, and so that's one data point. And the next one is in that same report, the detailed description of all of the different uses in 2010 and 2011. There were particularly good information about how it was used. And so these percentages that we have on the screen here describe, for that 2-year period, that there were 33% of the use of the Willows was either the school district or the recreation department. Of those 140, typical uses. The second highest use was for arts and craft show related events, 26%. The third highest was community and civic use, was 13%. And then followed that was weddings at 10%, corporate use at 9%, parties and other kinds of celebrations were 7%, and then fundraisers were 3%. So this is just a background data of something to keep in mind as we look to the future to say, do we want to have uses in the future that are similar to the way it was used in some of those periods, or do we want to have something different? So we're not here to say what the right answer to that is, but in this discussion today, and I'm going to let you get involved in this process very quickly. So that's where we were. And part of what we're going to hand out right now, and I think this might be a good time for Steve and Bill to hand out the survey. We have a questionnaire that's basically one piece of paper. We have maybe a dozen questions that we've asked. And as this is being handed out, we're also handing out a number of pens, so everybody has a writing implement. I'm going to just preview for you the questions that we're going to ask. Then I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes and just let you complete the survey. But basically, we want you to do this survey now because we're going to take the information from the survey. We're then going to put it back up onto the, and we're going to report back and ask people questions about why you think that. So, sure, I heard a question, but we need, yes, your question?
If you can go back a couple of slides. That one, right there. Nope.
This one?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, your question.
Before you, my voice is Terrace, and most of these people know me. Oh, I'm sorry. Before you post this study to the website, would you please add the information that the average number of events between 1998 and 2011 was 140 events per year? That gives the impression that there were only 140 events there total between 1998 and 2011. And if the average was 140 events per year, that's basically once every 3 days, which is a very different. And so I wouldn't want people to glance at this and think, oh gosh, in 13 years we only used it 140 times. What are we talking about?
I'm glad we have observant folks like you to keep us on our toes. So you are correct. It is 140 events per year. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. So the questions that we are going to ask you to look over would be, first, how would you like to see the Willows Mansion used in the future? All of you have answered that question about how you used it in the past on your dot as you came in, but now we want to have you circle all the examples of how you'd like to see it used in the future. And if we haven't listed a use that you want to see, we've left a couple spaces for you to write some other types of uses. The second question we're going to ask you to focus on will be to write down the name of a club or an organization that you think we should be aware of to make sure that they are considered as we look at what kinds of organizations and clubs, whether it be within the township or nearby, that should be considered. The third question we're asking is, from which funding sources would you suggest the ongoing operational costs for the mansion be paid? And we ask you to circle user fees or a discounted user fee for those of you that are township residents. Should it be from township funds or fundraising events or sponsorships or other sources? Feel free to circle any and all that you feel are appropriate. The fourth question is, on which street do you live or own property in Radnor Township? We'd be curious to know, you don't need a street number, just your street name. We want to just see geographically how diverse is everyone who's come to the meeting. And then the next question is, would you like to receive emails about upcoming future events? No need to provide it if you don't want to, but I'm aware that something in excess of 2,000 emails were sent out to make sure that as many folks as possible could participate in this. So we want to make sure that if you want to be kept aware of upcoming events, that we can let you know when we're next meeting. And then on the back page, I think it's called question 6, we've proposed a series of statements. Now, these are statements that we, Barton Partners, and our consultant team came up with, but they are in many ways helping us to understand whether these statements are statements with which you strongly agree. If you strongly agree, circle a 5. If you agree, circle a 4. If you feel you're neutral about the topic, a 3. If you disagree, circle a 2, or if you strongly disagree, circle a 1. And the first question, the first statement that we want you to evaluate is, the future uses of the Willows Mansion should be primarily public. Second question is, there should be no long-term leases to private entities. We want your opinion on that. The third question is, the business plan for the mansion should allow a wide range of event types, typically ranging from 25 to 150 guests, without creating excessive impacts on the parks or buildings. The fourth question is the plan for use of the mansion should allow for a mix of free and revenue-generating events to cover the operating costs for the mansion. The fifth question is the plan for use of the mansion should focus primarily on public events with low fees, and the costs for maintaining the facilities should be primarily covered by township funds. So these are really two different ways of looking at whether this is a facility that should be paid for by user fees primarily, or whether it should be something that should be more of a community use and low or no fee. And so those are some important choices as we move forward about the use of the mansion. One of the other items that we wanted to highlight and just sort of get your feedback on is I understand and support the necessity of removing some walls on the first floor of the mansion to allow for events of up to 150 guests. And I'm going to move over here for a minute and turn to this, turn to the boards we have in front here and highlight that this is obviously a picture of the mansion here. We have a map of a floor plan of the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, and the basement, you know, a very large facility. But one of the things to keep in mind that is if the township chooses in the future to allow for events of more than about 30 or 40 people, right now, I mean, this was designed as a residence in 1910, which has 1, 2, 3, 4 major rooms on the first floor as you come in from the front hall. The billiard room on the left, the living room on the right, and the dining room, living room in the center, and the dining room on the right. Those rooms can't accommodate 100 people in any one room. Is the microphone working here? Good. And so those rooms individually can't accommodate a large event. And so the only scenario whereby somebody who wanted to have an event like we're having here, this room has a capacity of 130 people. And so right now, for the Willows Mansion to accommodate 130 people, we would need to have enough space where everyone can see each other. And so one of the fundamental questions we need to look at as we move forward is it acceptable or desirable to remove some of the walls or add windows or add widened doorways into the mansion to allow it to be used for other larger uses? And so that's a key question, and we need to know whether that's okay. I mean, I think, you know, if this were to remain as a residence, you'd certainly want to have your billiard room and your living room and your dining room separate. But if this room is to serve larger audiences, if this room is to serve larger events where you can have 50 people, 75 people, 100 people, up to 150, many of these intermediate walls, and I'll use the pointer here so I'm not standing in front of everything, many of these intermediate walls would need to be opened up, and we'd need to find a way to maybe open up certain walls here, open up certain walls here to make sure that, so we want to get your input on whether the idea of opening up those walls makes sense. The next question that's sort of a similar nature, let me just, is the mansion terrace should be expanded and improved to allow for up to 150 people to enjoy the park views. Periodically, tents may be used to supplement the functions of the mansion and terrace. And so here, I think the question is really one of, is the idea of expanding this terrace, which currently is not large enough to have an event for a larger number of people, and so the goal here is not to offer two facilities for 150 to add up to 300. That's not the intention. The idea is to say that if somebody wanted to have an event on a beautiful May day and we wanted to be able to have some sort of a terrace facility, whether it included a tent or not, should the terrace facility be large enough to have an event, a large event at that time, or should we put resources into other things? Because clearly, removing walls in the mansion to make room for 150 people or 100 or whatever the determined number is, the outside terrace right now is probably set up for 75 folks or something like that to be out on the terrace. So that's a question as to how we move forward with the terrace itself.
Can I ask you a quick question about that? The 150, do you have sufficient parking with the... Do you have sufficient parking with the existing parking lot to accommodate 150 guests, or would 100, I don't know where you came up with the number for 150, but my question is, would 150 require an expansion of the existing parking lot?
It's a good question. We have done some preliminary parking account assessments for the parking facility closest to the mansion near the woods, and we believe there are about 57 parking spaces in the vicinity of the mansion itself, and there's another 18 parking spaces down by the cottage, and so there's, I think we have yet to count the number of parking spaces by the picnic area. And so we have not yet determined exactly how many parking spaces would be needed here or there. So that's, but I think the key here is whatever size is deemed appropriate by the township for upcoming future events, we need to make sure that there's the right number of bathrooms and the right number of parking spaces and the right number of accommodation for within the Willows mansion to accommodate that. So, as planners and architects, we think about it as an overall program. And so our goal is to figure out what's the right program for future use of the Willows. And so the parking, it would certainly be a part of that. And then the final range of questions get to this really important question of impact. One of the things that was stated very clearly in the request for proposal that we evaluated was that the township was seeking low impact uses of the mansion, and that there were many proposals that had been put forward by various groups for uses that were deemed to be too high impact. And so low impact is a term of art, and so we're trying to figure out, what does low impact mean? And so so I think the board is going to make a decision about what the maximum capacity, I assume at some point in time, would be allowed. But I think the other question is, how many of those larger events constitutes low impact? Is it a maximum of 20 events per year? Is it a maximum of 30 events per year? Is it 40 events per year? And one of the other layers of this will be, what are the revenue, what revenue can be generated by certain kinds of free use, sort of moderate, low impact uses and low cost uses? Typically, $300 to have, a party or a bat mitzvah or some sort of some of these smaller events, maybe a couple $100s for an event. Historically, many of the events in the 2010 to 11 and 12 period were $3,500 for an event to rent the facility. Those were just the historical numbers. So the question is, what will make sense economically is one question, but what will make sense in terms of low impact is another. And so we want to get your ideas on what low impact means to you. And so as soon as we finish getting the survey, I've got Steve and Bill are doing amazing things back there. They are calculating and tabulating and doing tallies to be able to, we're then going to ask you, once we get some initial numbers, we're then going to ask you, why do you feel this way? Because the why is as important as the what. And so I think one of the things that I'm going to maybe ask Steve, is now a good time to bring the two boards forward about what we've learned so far about past uses of the mansion? Sure.
It's related to Susan's question about parking and impact.
Yes.
Are you thinking only of number? Is there an assumption that will the park always remain open regardless of the events in the mansion?
We have not made any recommendations. That is obviously a policy question. I think I'm just going from my opinion is that I would think that the ongoing public access to the park is really important, and that there can be scenarios where the mansion is being used for one event and the cottage is being used for a second event, and folks who want to have a picnic can come and have a picnic. And so I certainly see no reason that the park can't be a multi-use public park that can have multiple events.
Because you have low impact there only as the number of events, and it never even, well, you put the number. To me, low impact is about having adequate parking and maintaining access to the park.
I think you raise
so
a very...
I don't know how to answer the questions. As long as there's adequate parking that doesn't substantially change the park and everyone can still use it, then the number is less important. So
I think your point is a very good one, and remember the guiding principle that we talked about earlier, which was think holistically. Your question is really about holistic and making sure that we're looking at the whole and looking at multi-use, and we're looking at ways in which ongoing public access to the non-mansion portions of the park can occur concurrently and have enough parking. So good consideration. We will certainly look at that. Steve, is this a good time for you to help us report back on what we've learned so far?
Sure. We haven't done much with the questionnaire. That's still being tallied as they have been turned in. But we've got some tallies here as far as how many times people have attended events at the mansion, and then what kinds of events. And I think we've got just about everybody with their dots on the board. There may be one or two people who ran to their seats in order to hear what you were having to say, Mark. But as far as the number of times, and this is all kind of in relative comparative types of numbers, but how many times people have attended an event at the mansion, the category of 1 to 5 events ever, in lifetimes, garnered 16 dots, 16 votes. 6 to 10 events were 7 times. And then over 20 times attending events at the mansion was also 7. Then all the other categories, 16 to 20, 11 to 15 events, or even a few people have not been to the mansion yet. They may be newcomers to the community, and the mansion hasn't been in use in the last few years. Those 3 other categories combined to 8 times, or 8 votes, 8 people who've indicated that. So concentrated in that 1 to 10 events over time.
Okay.
As far as the kinds of events that have been attended, one of the patterns that I saw here is it matches up fairly well with the slide that is up on the screen right now in terms of historical use during the years 2010 and 2011 in terms of the percentage breakdown. Maybe the one thing or one type of activity that stood out to us was that while parties and celebrations were just 7% historical use in 2010 and 2011 for really the entire mansion. For this group, parties, there were 17 votes which put it probably in the top 5 category, a comparable percentage to some of these other categories like meetings, township-wide events or concerts, and Parks Department and School District. So when you look at the top 5, you'd have township-wide events and concerts, community or club meeting would be second, along with the Parks Department. School District comes in at 18, and that would be third, and then parties were 17. The other area where this group did not measure up to the historical use in 2010 and 2011, corporate events, just one person has attended an event there for that purpose, whereas we see in 2010 and 2011, that was a category that earned 9% in terms of the activity there. Mm-hmm. So that's what we've got so far.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
Roberta?
I think you'll need to bring the microphone over. By the way, just so everyone gets a little context, our thought is that we would run through 4 or 5 of the questions, the ones that we think are maybe 3 or 4, depending on what the time is, to sort of tease out and hear from you, gee, it looks like 65% are in favor of this idea. Help us understand why. So we're going to be asking you to give us feedback on the why. And then at the end, we're going to welcome any general comment you have, so that if you have an idea that we haven't even thought of or a question that we haven't thought of, we're going to welcome general comments at the end for anyone who wants to have a broad and general comments. But welcome your question.
Thank you. I appreciate the numbers and the data that you're gathering. I think it may be helpful in terms of looking at the numbers of events that have been attended by different participants in the meeting tonight, to also consider how many years people have been residents in this community.
Right.
Because I think that might impact whether you've been here 20 times or not at all, considering the facility has not been opened for the public for a few years.
Yeah. The other thing that we are well aware of is that at this meeting, we don't appear to have many 10-year-olds or 5-year-olds, or we have a few that might be in the sort of the 20s category, which I'm thrilled to see. And so we just need to be reminded that this audience is not necessarily the complete slice of who is out there and probably enjoying the park right now. And so as we look to the future, we want to be reminded that we need to sort of have a voice for everyone who uses the facility, not just those who come to meetings. I don't have the microphone. Yep, sorry. Sorry, you had one question. Yeah.
Oh, so, sorry, this is the question.
I think it's on, yeah.
Okay. This is the question that has actually been on my mind for well over a year, because I've been watching this for that long. Appreciate the information, and I even appreciate some of the neutrality to the questions, so I really do acknowledge that it can be hard to come up with neutral questions. The question that's been missing from the whole conversation, from my recollection, is that there's been somewhat of a presumption from the get-go that the township residents would be unwilling to support renovating and reopening the building, and having it be a part of our tax base. Now, that might be a correct assumption, it might be an incorrect assumption. But I don't know if it is. And my question to you is, I'm wondering if there's a way, to speak to your comment a moment ago, there's not 10-year-olds here, there's not 20-year-olds. There's 36 people here. We have a town of 20,000. 8,000 tax bills go out a year. So there's a wider audience to ask the neutral questions of, perhaps we're not asking the right questions.
Okay.
And a more basic question would be, we asked a question about open space a number of years ago and got a resounding response from the township that as a community we were willing to bear the expense to preserve open space. Right. If there is a neutral way to ask the question, are we as a community willing to bear the expense to renovate or operate this building without a private-public partnership, is that something that this community would withstand? And is there a way for us to ask that question that doesn't prejudice the answer?
Good comments. I think I think we're at the beginning, at least as far as our team is concerned. We're at the beginning. Your community has been discussing the Willows for many years. I'm aware of that. We only need to look at the website and look at all the proposals and requests for proposals, and so to be reminded that if this were easy, it would have been done. And so I am confident that we're going to present a series of alternatives in our draft business plan in August, and we're going to then present a series of a final business plan, a set of alternatives in September, and your Board of Commissioners has some important decisions to make about how to move forward, and there may be a way to connect with the 10-year-olds and the 15-year-olds and as many voices as possible. We're trying to be as transparent as possible here. I think I want to acknowledge that there's a group of people that has been helping to share and promote transparency, and it's a group called the Willows Park Trust. And these are individuals who have, through their volunteer efforts, have been trying to get the word out and trying to promote a dialogue about public access and public use of the mansion. And so I think there are individuals who are actively involved in trying to promote that level of transparency, that level of dialogue. And so I'm confident that as we move forward and as our team identifies alternatives, we're not here to make choices. We're here to present alternatives that respond to the wide range of concerns. And so I'm confident that we'll get those alternatives out there and get good input on that. So, Bill and Steve, how are we doing back there with the counting? Okay. Are there? Would it make sense for you to bring some results to us so that we could start on one or two of the questions? That would be great. I would.
Just a quick question.
Sure. I'm going to hand you the microphone here.
I'm a bit new to the story here, but I think a little background might help me understand things.
Sure.
The mansion was in operation. It was being used for all those purposes, and people were paying for those uses, and whatever money was being collected wasn't cutting it. Is that the gist?
No, I'm sure others could speak to it with more authority than I can, but from what I understand, around 2012, the township decided to discontinue broad public access to the facility and has been trying to make some important decisions about maintenance and roofs and accessibility and what kinds of upgrades to the facility are warranted. And so I don't think that it was a question. I think if we look at the financial numbers, and we're still combing through a lot of data, but as I understand it, the revenue was roughly balancing the cost of utilities and sort of the general operational costs of maintaining the building. The park as a whole, cutting the grass and upgrading the bridge that was rebuilt, and those costs have been, like any park anywhere in the township, those are costs. Those are costs of maintaining a public asset. And I know there are quite a number of public facilities, but this is one of the more important parks in the township. And so I don't think that it was a cost question. I think it was a question of, is the building, what repairs do we need to make to the building to make sure that those with disabilities can have fair access to the building? What kind of upgrades to the mechanical systems are warranted? What kind of improvement should we be making to the roof? And so I think when you have old buildings, you need to make sure that you, I think, I get the impression that the township was trying to be appropriately cautious about not having really big events without fixing the things that needed to be repaired. And so I think there's a number of things in the reports that we've been provided that highlight needs to repair a number of items. And so I think the question is really, how should the township invest in those? And there were a number of proposals where private entities came forward and said, wow, we'd be happy to make upgrades to the facility, but we want long-term private use of the facility. And right now, the scenarios that we've been asked to evaluate are primarily public use of the facility that may have a combination of revenue-generating uses in combination with public access use of those. So
Different revenue-generating uses than 1998 through 2011.
Right now, we don't know
Okay.
what revenue-generating uses are appropriate. That we're trying to gather information about what is the right mix of uses, public free uses for the school district and for the parks department, and what kinds of revenue-generating uses if you're a township resident and you want to use the facility. My understanding is that township residents historically have received a reduced rate. If you are not a township resident or you're a commercial entity and you wanted to do a fundraiser for your corporation or whatever, you would pay a higher rate. And so I think what we have, our consulting team has been asked to look at is, what are some scenarios that address these 10 principles and make sense for the future, make sense in terms of capital improvements? And one of the things that the township said in the request for proposal, that they may be willing to expend up to $1 million of capital improvements in the building. And so that's a scenario that we need to help figure out. There's a number of reports out there identifying what things could be repaired. So I think it's really, it's making sure that there's a good plan for the future.
Yeah, thanks. That helps a lot. And then you guys are presenting to the board in September, and there's the talk of the holistic approach. Or do you know, is it their intention to not really make a decision until the entire park at large is considered, like the cottage or the parking? I mean, is it going to be one final?
What I'm aware of is that the reason that it's unusual to have a meeting in July for a very public facility like this, but because many people are going to be away. But I think that the reason that we're meeting in July 11th, July 17th, mid-August and September 11th, the reason that we're meeting now is because the capital budgeting process that the township goes through each year to decide what to spend money on in 2018 occurs in September and October and in the fall. And so the Township Board of Commissioners wants to make an informed decision based upon the recommendations or the alternatives that we put forward to make a decision about capital improvements to the mansion. I don't think that we have not received any information to suggest that the township is going to wait to talk about the cottage next or the rest of the park. I think that the question and the focus is on the mansion. What to do about the mansion and what kinds of investments in the mansion are appropriate.
Great. Thanks very much.
You bet.
Sorry. Thank you. Actually, I have two questions. First, and I'm sorry, I was a little bit late. Under guiding principles, public use, the first bullet item talks about the deed, and I've heard a number of issues around the deed. I don't know what's real and what's not real about deed restrictions, and when it says that it should be dedicated to primarily public uses, with respect to the deed for this land. What is the deed? What are the restrictions? And does that include more than just the house? Does it include the property? Can you illuminate on that?
The deed says related to public use says, whereas it appears in the present and future interests of the township to acquire such land in its entirety for that purpose. So this is when it was purchased. I believe this was the 1970s, if I recall correctly. And then it says, Section 1, by virtue and in pursuance of the authority vested in the acts of Assembly, the Board of Commissioners hereby authorizes the selection, appropriation, and condemnation of the following described property for park, playground, recreation areas, and facilities. So it's a little bit arcane, a little bit hard to sort of make sense of, but the key is park, playground, recreation areas, and facilities. And so that is what the deed says related to use. I am not an attorney. I'm not here to interpret that as much as to say I think this is not saying it's here for commercial purposes. And so I think the policy number 1, and really that guiding principle here for public use, this publicly owned park, mansion, and cottage should be dedicated primarily for public uses to serve the township as its residents. So that is what we believe the deed says in broad strokes, and I think how we determine how public, how many of the events, is it okay for, you're to have a christening there? Is it okay to have a fundraiser there? Is it okay to have a party, a celebration? Is it okay to have a corporation that wants to have their holiday party there? Is that okay? And so I think public use, seems to include a number of those public access uses. And so, we're not here to make any final determinations. We're here to present a range of alternatives that address that broad public use.
Okay, and my second question is the fourth bullet item related to the economic sustainability. And you briefly spoke on it there, but that last piece that says that it needs to be able to cover the operating costs for the facilities once it is improved. So I guess the assumption that you're working under is you're developing a business case, right? I mean, that's the outcome of this discussion is to propose business case?
This is a public park, and it's up to the Board of Commissioners to make a determination as to whether this should be a break-even activity where the mansion, if it costs $100,000 of utilities and operational costs a year, could the revenue generated from user fees generate $100,000? Whether the park itself is the grass is being cut, the lawn, the ponds are being maintained, the bridges are being improved, and things like that are being paid for by, I presume, township-wide funds, and so that's being maintained as a park and is a cost of operating it as a park. I think it's up to the board to then determine what is the details of economic sustainability. Right now, this one here suggests cover the operating costs for the mansion. And so right now we're gathering information about what does it cost to operate the building on an annual basis. And so part of what we're going to present back is a business plan, a business case to say, but how much, what elements should be included in that? We'll present a number of alternatives to the commissioners for their evaluation.
All right, so just making sure that I'm clear then in what your goal is in the end in terms of what the township commissioners have asked you to do, your organization, is to pull together a business plan related to the building,
Yes.
the mansion,
Yes.
not necessarily the rest of the property and the cottage, and I get
Nope.
that. I mean,
Nope.
that makes total sense to me. But that business plan is making an assumption that there's going to be a capital improvement that the business plan does not need to necessarily
cover in the operating cost. This is
Okay.
the
Okay.
assumption.
I'm
of
just
the-
trying to get
yeah,
clear on what the
ass-
objective is.
The assumption in the RFP was that the township said they may be willing to invest up to $1 million in the capital improvements of the mansion.
So will part of your business plan or your recommendation, in the end, when this is all said and done about the building, advise or provide recommendation as to what that level of investment needs to be for capital improvements in order to make the business plan
Yeah, yes.
Feasible.
Yes, I think within limits.
Okay.
We have been asked to evaluate the previous studies, which there's a number of previous studies that address life safety improvements, stairs, roofs, bathrooms,
basic stuff.
all sorts of stuff like that. And we need to determine whether all the I's and T's were dotted if we come up with a use for wow, we want to have an indoor swimming pool. Well, they didn't evaluate an indoor swimming pool, so we may need to go do some cost estimating if there's some new use that we haven't thought of, where we may need to do some additional cost estimating. But in the end, our goal and our commission is to really look at the costs of operating the building and identify appropriate capital improvements to make the building and the immediate adjacent terrace usable for the uses that we all discuss here are appropriate.
Okay, cool. And then my very last question, related to competition and other, will your business plan then, I guess I'm assuming, once you've narrowed down what the community's perspective is on the building and the uses of the building, will your business plan then roll into whatever else local competition is doing? Like, let's say we want to turn it back into being a rental facility. Will you look at other local, Applewood or others, that are using a similar type and provide us some scope?
Urban Partners, the economic consultants that are working as a part of our team, will be doing research on competitive facilities to say the rate for renting this space for 50 people for a day or 25 people for 2 hours or 100 people for whatever will be compared to other facilities providing similar function in the immediate area. So yes, we are looking at how this facilities relates to other competitive offerings.
Great, thanks.
I'm going to ask Steve to come give the update, because I think everybody's on the edge of your seat. Are you all on the edge of your seat right now? I hope so, because Steve is going to let us know what we've learned so far about your questionnaire results. And we're not focusing on every one of the questions, but we tried to pick the top 4 or 5 that we thought would be insightful. We're going to report back in greater detail next week what we've learned in detail. But we wanted to give you a snapshot and then see if we can't frame some questions to you about why you chose these things.
Thanks, Mark. We had a total of 41 questionnaires filled out and returned, and hopefully everybody got theirs in and got them back to us so that we could tally them. Our counts are pretty close to exact or accurate. There might be, maybe off by 1 or 2, but the results are pretty clear in terms of the opinions that people expressed, particularly on the questions that dealt with strongly agree, disagree kinds of responses. The first one that we looked at had to do with the future uses of the Willows mansion should be primarily public. There's been a lot of discussion about that already tonight. The results, out of 41 questionnaires, 34 indicated they either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, and there was 1 person who disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. and a few others were neutral. So we didn't count the neutral ones. It was either agree, strongly agree, or disagree, strongly disagree in these tallies. So again, we're hearing pretty loud and clear the future uses of the mansion should be primarily public is something that this group in particular really agrees with.
And I guess,
Mark, microphone.
I'm sorry. Oh. For maybe we can just get a raise of some hands of people who are sort of in favor of this idea of public. Okay, and I'd like to hear from one or two people about why you feel that way, and just sort of make sure that we focus our energy. So who's somebody that could maybe tell us a little bit more about?
I'm holding the microphone.
Yes. Oh, perfect.
And I'd be
Perfect.
happy to.
Sure.
As a not long, but as a pretty long time Radnor resident, I have found that the Willows is really one of our treasures. I myself have hosted an engagement party for my daughter there. It was too many people for our house, and this way we could be generous in inviting everybody that made sense for this. And I've also, for a friend, helped host a wedding. Mm-hmm. So I've personally used it, but it's not just how much we love it, my family, my friends. It's when I mentioned to other people who don't even live here that the Willows is up for grabs and we don't know what's going to happen. There's a great sadness. You mentioned Appleford. There are some beautiful, beautiful places on the main line that people pick. Marion Tribute House, Appleford. I've been to events at many beautiful, beautiful places, but the Willows is one of them. And I think it would be a great loss for our township, to lose it. I have this because I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
You were mentioning that the township is prepared to pay up to about $1 million for capital improvements. Has your company or somebody you've designated done some kind of cost estimate of what the most important things are, what we absolutely have to do, what they might cost, and what we don't really have to do? It can be for a later time. Is there something
the
like...
township hired a group called Avison Young. They prepared a series of 6 alternatives ranging from mothballing to demolition to moderate renovation to a full-scale renovation, and they ranged anywhere between $250,000 and $2.5 million, and everywhere in between. Whether the exact scenarios that they were asked to evaluate match exactly the scenarios that we discuss right here, some of those scenarios may be close. And so I don't know how the township arrived at the $1 million, but I do. So I think we're going to be guided by that report, guided by those alternatives, and we may identify that there's 2 or 3 other variations on a theme that should be explored a little further, but we're guided by those documents, those cost estimates, and we'll certainly use those as we move forward. Maybe from 1 or 2 other people on this.
I have a vocabulary question.
Sure.
Because I don't know how to understand these answers. A private party hosted by a township resident, is that a public use or a private use? I assume that's a private use. Why is that a public use? Public to me is school district recreation, community civic, and arts and crafts show that anyone in the community can come to. A private use in my mind is I'm having a private party and I invite who I want to invite. So I think I was probably one of the neutral people on that, but I assumed that was a private use. So just that's a vocabulary question. If you're not defining what something is and we're answering the same exact question, I completely agree. I want to be able to host a private party in addition to having public events there. But I thought an engagement party was a private use.
And I think there is a fundamental question, one of the questions that we asked in here is, these are statements. One of the statements that we put in here is, the plan for use of the mansion should primarily focus on public events with low fees, and the cost for maintaining the facility should be primarily covered by township funds. There is a scenario that the township may choose to move forward with, whereby just like it pays for all of the maintenance of all the parks, the township could say, wow, we're okay to pay $100,000 to maintain the facility and not have any private uses, but it would mean that there would be a cost to the taxpayers for maintaining the building.
But you're not addressing my question. He came up and said that 30-some people out of the room said that they supported public use, not public-private partnership. And I don't know whether a private party by a township resident is a public use or a private use.
Sure.
So hi, everybody. I'm Christina Peroni, and I'm part of the Willows Park Trust. The way we were defining public use was really a combination of public and private, meaning you could rent it for your graduation, for your whatever, but primarily public means, A, you have the ability to rent it. It's not already taken by the Joe Schmo catering company, and you have no ability to get in there. And the other reason is that it's not all the time. So that's part of why you were asked the question about use. So 150 people is the maximum. We said that the community, that's the maximum amount we wanted in the building, because that's sort of what historically was done. And so now the question is, how many times do we want to rent it out so it's just for you? You know, all the past uses that we've had before, more than half of them are private events. You know, the Boy Scouts, you know, I can't show up at a Boy Scout meeting, you know, so, you know, yeah, it sounds weird, the semantic, yes, right. Primarily public, how we were defining it means it is not the Joe Schmo catering company, and you can't use it. It's citizen use. Yes, exactly. Like the library, where the rooms downstairs you can rent. So it's for us, Fenimore Park. So it's available to the community.
How's that different from the next question on the list? The public-private partnership, how does
That is completely different.
explain
Right. Well, I think there are scenarios where some municipalities have said we are willing to make a public facility, you know, to have a catering company to spend $1 million to have the 5-year rights to, or 10-year rights or whatever, to rent that facility like 50 days a year, 75 days a year, and they have a long-term contract, and they would have an exclusive contract in exchange for their willingness to invest $1 million, $2 million, whatever amount of dollars. And so the challenge of that, and the things that we've heard not accepted by the commissioners in recent years, is that that would take it out of the public realm to make day-to-day, week-by-week decisions about, wow, you know, on, you know, May 25th or whatever, we're going to have a community-wide celebration, and maybe Radnor Township wants to have the authority to say, we want to maintain the flexibility to say, no, we don't want it to be used 50 times a year by a caterer. We want to have it be used, you know, 50 different groups. And so I think one of the questions that statements that we put in number B, there should be no long-term leases to private entities. I think it's different to say, you know, I would like to have a wedding for my daughter there on one day in May. It's different to say my company wants to have exclusive use for 50 weddings. Those are different. That would be an exclusive contract.
So you finish that sentence, restricting community use. Like, you know, so where it would be leased to private entities restricting community use.
Yes.
It might be a little more descriptive.
Okay. Yeah, so.
So I went with the public issue because because the notion of the...
Let's get you a microphone, I'm sorry.
The notion of the...
Why don't you repeat that so everybody can
I
hear?
said, I prefer the public entity use, because the notion that a company would come in and with a long-term lease have exclusive rights to the building and be making a profit, a consistent profit, off of a public park is just not, doesn't settle for me.
Okay.
And the way I have kind of in my mind made it, you know, we're treating the Willows differently than we treat Fenimore Woods. People come in and you can book Fenimore Woods and rent the gazebo and have a private party there. But people can still be on the playground, and you can't restrict who parks in the parking lot at Fenimore Woods, if anybody else is familiar with Fenimore Woods. We would no sooner bring in, you know, Domino's Pizza to set up a private pizza stand at Fenimore Woods 50 weeks a year, and that's the only vendor that you can use to bring food to Fenimore Woods Park. And this is the same concept. This is a piece of public land. And so for me, the notion that we would bring in a private exclusive entity, first is me, resident, picking up a bunch of Domino's pizzas and having a party at the gazebo at Fenimore. And that's really the difference.
Thank you. And I think, so I think you're helping us to understand what public and primarily public mean, and part of what I think we have an obligation to do as we move forward is to use clarity in our words and use clarity in the intentions of this business plan to parse the difference between a long-term exclusive contract and versus a occasional one-day use of the facility. And so I think those are things that we can then take to heart as we move forward.
I'm going to add one more thing to that. The reason our group got started was because we were so vehemently opposed to leasing out our park. And so I think consistently, whenever plans have come up to permanently lease out our park, the public has rejected it. So the concept here with Barton Partners is that they come up with a plan, understanding the expenses and the costs, but that it still is a public park for primarily public use.
Sure.
Okay, well, just we'd like to have this on the microphone, sorry.
Just to bring me up to speed like that gentleman, since 2012, has it been used at all?
It's my understanding that it has not been used.
So no money is being generated?
That is my understanding.
Wow.
There's issues with the building.
Okay, what I'd like to have Steve do is share one or two more of the questions. Yeah. So do you have a question related to that topic?
I do. It's a quick one.
Sure.
In the event that the guidance of the room takes root and the preference becomes for public access, is there part of that plan that, quote unquote, guarantees enough public use to sustain the operation? What if there's not enough rentals? What's plan B?
Well, we will be presenting what we have heard in terms of this public meeting on the 17th next week. We will then be evaluating the regional norms for what the rental rate for a day use of a facility like this could likely bring in, and we will be presenting back, you know, for example, if we said, oh, there can only be 5 major events per year, we may determine that 5 events may be I mean, if just as a history as a guide, if $3,500 is the maximum typical rental rate for the room, the building for a day, that if you did that 5 times a year, that'd be, you know, $17,500. There's, if that were the only revenue, you know, the costs of maintaining the building are typically exceeding $100,000, and so that would mean that the township would somehow have to come up with the $85,000 of shortfall
Well, I perceive a lack of will on the part of the township to commit to an uncertain proposition like that.
Right,
For
and
me,
so-
the primary and only appeal of a public-private partnership is an element of certainty that it gives. This opening up, on an annual basis to public rentals is uncertain. That's my only
Okay.
point.
Well, I think we are going to be presenting a series of scenarios based upon a range of alternatives for a range of intensities of use. And so what comes of that, what alternatives are deemed acceptable by the Board of Commissioners, they will guide which alternatives we should focus in on and how much revenue is appropriate. So, okay, Steve, would you please enlighten us about a few more of the questions?
And related to that whole issue and discussion about revenue and balancing costs with those revenues, as well as public and the long-term private use, question or statement D on the questionnaire read, the plan for use of the mansion should allow for a mix of free and revenue-generating events to cover the operating costs for the mansion. So the plan for use, a mix of free and revenue-generating events to cover the operating costs of the mansion. Again, 41 total questionnaires were turned in. 35 responded either agree or strongly agree. So that many responded that they agree that a mix of free and revenue-generating events to cover the operating costs. 3 responded they disagreed with that statement, and 3 more were neutral. So pretty clear indication from this group that when we're talking about the costs, we'd like to cover them and try to do it with an appropriate mix, and that'll be part of the tough thing to tackle in this project. What's the appropriate mix of free, no-cost public uses versus those private-type revenue-generating uses that we can perhaps get a balance? We need a microphone.
I just have a quick question about, like, semantically. So revenue generating, does that mean people, like, is it limited to people paying to get into the event, or could it be the Boy Scouts want to have their meeting here, so they pay to rent out the space? Is that's considered revenue generating? Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think one of the other questions on the other side of the questionnaire asked about from which funding sources you would suggest we try to cover these costs. User fees are the kinds of fees that you talked about. Discounted fees perhaps for township residents. Some township funds perhaps. Fundraising events. So fundraising going on at the mansion to help cover the costs of the mansion could be another way. Sponsorships, we get some involvement of community businesses and other organizations to invest in the mansion, support the mansion because of its community value. So, and this is all part of that mix that the team will be looking at in its recommendations.
Steve, I just,
Yes,
a couple of things. One is you guys are doing a great job of trying to pull a lot of stuff and get it down to the narrow part of the funnel, so we appreciate that. I think the public-private part is maybe better termed public-commercial, because I think in terms of a commercial entity being in there as opposed to being a private party, that's a different deal. The other thing I wanted to say is, bottom line is on the dollar side, the Board of Commissioners has to, at some point, if there's not enough revenue ultimately coming in to cover the cost of the mansion, you've got to tear it down if you're not going to take care of it. So the Board of Commissioners at some point has to step up and say, we will cover the shortfall, because if they don't, nobody else is going to do it.
And I think part of what this process is going to reveal, and we believe we're hearing it here, is that people love this park, people love this mansion, and the way forward, like we have to invest in our homes and put new roofs in our home and replace the boiler, the township has to make an important decision about replacing the roof and fixing the boiler and improving the windows and all those things. And so this is, I think, in many ways focusing on how much do you love the mansion and how are we going to plan for the future so that it's going to be here for our children and our grandchildren to enjoy. And so I think that's a larger message that I hope we can communicate to the commissioners and make sure we get known is the passion that people have for this park and this mansion.
Well, that was one of my questions, because in that questionnaire, it's saying covering the operating cost. Included in those operating costs, are you including reserves for the future, for roof repair in 20 years, for the boiler repair in 20 years, so that you don't have a mansion sitting empty for 5 years while we decide what's going on?
I could imagine there may be some scenarios that might involve the potential for some reserves. I think it's going to come down to saying, if we come back and say, gee, there's only 50 people can use the space at one time and the revenue generating from those uses won't cover the cost, then there wouldn't be a reserve. If there's a strategy for creating some level of sinking fund for reserves for capital improvements to contribute towards that cost over time, that would be even better. So I think we're certainly going to look at that. We will be meeting with township staff to make sure that we understand what is being put into the building now and in recent years for electrical upgrades and painting and refinishing the floors, and utilization of the facility will incur costs to clean the facility so I think we're going to have to identify as many line items as possible that address day-to-day annual operation of it. I think, however, I don't think that the operational cost is likely to include, capital improvements. This is, that would be a whole nother level of income that is way beyond. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. We are approaching 8 o'clock. You've all been generous with your time, and I'd love to make sure that we have any closing comments. I think we are going to be sort of taking your ideas to heart and documenting all the things we've heard. So if anyone has any new ideas, something that hasn't been raised so far, we would love to hear that now. So, yeah.
Perfect entrance. I'm here because I have a vision for the Willows as certainly to use it for public commercial use at times, but to use it for a community is in a cultural arts arena. Our community is rich in many different ways. We have a lot of community members who have to go to the city for cultural arts, whether it's the orchestra or to see a show or anything in the cultural arts venue. And I don't know if that's something that's been considered, to invite orchestras to perform or have even professional puppeteers come for our children.
Mm-hmm.
This could be revenue generating, and I don't know if that's ever been brought up, but I
love the idea, and I think
lectures and
sure
things like that.
Yeah, I would say that we should definitely, in the name of looking broadly at future uses, I love it, and I think we should certainly consider those kinds of ideas as we look forward. Yes.
Moving the senior center here, maybe?
We need to I want to hear from some. Yes. Sorry.
I just have a quick question with regards to the day-to-day management of it. So if it does become, this great spot for people to come and utilize it, who will be responsible for the day-to-day management? Is that going to be part of your plan? And then how will we be marketing it? How will we be getting it out there to people who might be willing beyond just the township, who might be wanting to rent it for a cultural event or an arts and crafts fair or something like that? because that's where we're going to be generating the revenue. And in the past, I know when it was being utilized, even around that time, I think it was just kind of one of those things. Everybody kind of knew it was there, and you knew you could call Tammy, and maybe you could reserve it. And so I think that and I'm hoping that would be part of your plan. I'm sure it will be, because you guys are way more well versed than I.
Well, great. Well, I think you've highlighted a bunch of key issues. Creating recommendations for a governance plan for how it would be reserved and which kinds of groups could rent it and how frequently, could certain kinds of uses be used. All of those things are important. And I think in our meeting with Township staff, we will be learning all the different mechanics that are involved in renting the mansion and any other Township facility to figure out, what's a good plan moving forward. I think your point about promotion and marketing and all those things, we certainly will touch on that. This is not a marketing plan or a marketing strategy in what we will be preparing this summer, but I think certainly moving forward, once it's clear what the uses are, that may very well be an important next step.
I just have one thing to say on top of that is once you have the management of this, you get the township staff, you're going to have to actually budget in. That's going to be part of the budget, is putting together the management staff for that. Because as it is right now, our management staff for the Parks and Rec will not be able to handle this big of a project. So there is a big cost associated to this, and it's actually something the BOC needs to be able to say, yes, we are willing to put our commitment into this department, into a new department of the Willows on its own.
It's a great point, and I think all a part of operations and making sure that there's a framework in place to manage this going forward. So I think we're going to take one more question here or comment and wrap it up. So what would you like to share with us?
Just a quick question. I'm sure you were saying a construction company came in and they assessed several alternatives. I'm wondering if there was any consideration to maintaining the historical value of the house. Like, I know you mentioned potentially, putting in new lights, new paint, like taking out walls. Has there been any consideration? Is there anyone, or is there any way that could be assessed, like maintaining that sort of historical value? Because I assume it's a pretty old house. I don't know.
That's a really great point. I think we are aware that a great deal of research has been done in terms of historic designation. We are immersing ourselves in reading all these reports in these coming weeks, and certainly maintaining its historical significance is something that should be strongly considered. I think that's something that we will be considering and will be woven into the recommendations and alternatives. So
I just want to say that prior to these years, or the years that you're mentioning in these charts, the Willows did operate at and actually made money.
Really?
Yes. And I don't think many people in the township realize this because they haven't lived here that long. Mm-hmm. But it made money, and there were two women who pretty much did this organizational thing of setting up the scheduling, making sure people came in and cleaned, did whatever was necessary to make it a smooth running operation. And it made money then. Now, I'm not sure that that's a good business model now or what you're thinking of, but I think that that can't be dismissed.
Okay. Well, that's a great way to sort of leave it. I think this is the beginning of a 3-month listening and process. I really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. It's been great to have your input and ideas, and I look forward to seeing you at upcoming events. And thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you. That's good. Here's back your pen. Thank you. Quick, do you know if the 100,000 did that include